Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our May Supply Chain Lunch and Learn. This is a monthly free webinar that we do in meeting format to encourage Q&A and discussion amongst colleagues. This month's topic is EUDR in practice, industry voices on the front line of compliance. We are delighted to welcome Chris Saynor of EDItEUR and Elizabeth Bartheld of Sylvamo to speak with us today. Elizabeth is going to kick things off with a presentation, followed by Chris, and then we'll have the rest of the time for discussion. Just a couple housekeeping disclaimers for folks. We do have a hard stop for our speakers at 10 minutes before the hour this time because they have other engagements. And we are not lawyers. We're not giving legal advice. So if you do have questions, definitely consult with your counsel. So without any further ado, I will turn things over to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, welcome.
Great. Thanks for having me again. I am going to pop some slides up on the screen. Hopefully you guys can see those. So I'm Elizabeth Bartheld. I'm the VP of Global Government Relations for Sylvamo. A little bit about Sylvamo. We're headquartered in the US. We're making uncoated free sheet. We're headquartered in Memphis. We employ over 6,500 employees globally, and our net sales in 2024 were 3.8 billion. In the US, we employ about 1,800 colleagues. We're the second largest uncoated free sheet paper in North America. We primarily make and sell copy paper, commercial printing, converting, specialty papers, and our brands include Hammermill, Accent Opaque, Spring Hill, and Williamsburg. And then a little bit about us globally. We have 3 mills in Brazil and 2 in Europe, 1 in Sweden and in France. And I tell you that because EUDR, what we're here to talk about today, has impacted us on all 3 regions. We'll keep this discussion mainly North America, but some of the first few slides will be a little basic, but just to level set on EUDR. As we all know, it's part of the EU Green Deal. It will take effect at the end of this year. There was, of course, a rush last year to do an amendment to extend it for a year, but it's planning to take place this year, at the end of this year. It bans the import and export of products linked to deforestation and forest degradation. And of course, wood and derived products like paper are in that regulation. So how do you comply? There are multiple steps needed to comply, including getting the geographical coordinates of the wood. We'll get more into this in a little bit. You might not need the Latin long U as a operator in or a trader going into Europe. You need to demonstrate there's no deforestation or forest degradation, and you've got to comply with local laws and regulation in the region. We'll need to conduct due diligence, mitigate risk as necessary, depending on your country benchmarking. Just a little bit on country benchmarking. That is the information that we're still waiting on the commission for. It's expected this summer. It could come out in June, if not before. That's where countries will be designated with a certain risk criteria, high, standard, or low. There was a recent article in Bloomberg that stated the US would be deemed a low risk. While that sounds great, it is to some extent, but low risk is just simplified due diligence. It exempts you from risk assessment and risk mitigation, but you still are going to need the geographical coordinates, or your suppliers will need the geographical coordinates on the wood harvested. It also means at a low risk that the competent authorities are only going to run about 1%, a check on the operators about 1% of the time. In addition to how to comply, you're going to need to submit information to the EU Traces system or IT system called Traces, generate DDS numbers, which include a reference number and a verification number. Each shipment is accompanied with a DDS statement. That information includes the product name, trade name, a description, the type and species of trees, and the quantity, the geolocation, like I've been saying, time and date of range of harvest, the contact details for the supplier. All that's uploaded into the EU IT system. and it gives these reference numbers and verification numbers. The reference number is about a 14-digit code, both letters and number, and it's unique for each DDS that's submitted. Just quickly, what happens if you don't comply? There are penalties. It's about 4% of your EU turnover. Your goods are confiscated. You're kind of put on a naughty list. And of course, the reputational harm that would happen with that. I'll go a little bit into the traces or into the traceability for pulp and paper. This is really kind of almost more of a European case because of this part right here. It's likely not the case that the EU wood supplier is going to be placing the initial product on the market. For the US, this has been kind of a pinch point for us. And it's been a difficult to implement for some paper manufacturers. Some companies are further along than others. To give you an idea of the magnitude of that, more than half the US forest land is owned or managed by 10.6 million private landowners. These private landowners provide about 90% of the wood for forest products industry. Another additional issue for several manufacturers is the chips or sawmill residuals. So each manufacturer is different. On average, the industry makes about 40% of its wood inputs are the sawmill residuals or chips or forest residue. And the other 60% is that solid wood. I don't have a chip mill on here to show you that piece. We would like to think at Sylvamo we're further along than others. We've been working on this for almost 2 years. We've been working through different scenarios in the US where we would compile and actually submit a due diligence statement and supply our customers with the RN or the reference numbers and the verification numbers. At Sylvamo, we call it the golden ticket. The new FAQs does make it clear that downstream customers can reference the RN, the reference numbers. They don't have to have the geolocation numbers. That's pretty clear for the EU. Again, we've tested it in the IT system. The FAQs aren't 100% clear that you can do that in third countries like the US. But so far, our testing has allowed us to do that. One other question, so I mentioned the chips, our plan of getting the DDS, submitting the DDS statement for our customers so they don't have to have all these Latin longs. The other thing that we are pushing forward towards is how are we going to get this information to the customers? We're looking at several different scenarios, working with our customers, whether it's a CSV file, whether it's on our Sylvamo shop, whether it's an email. It likely will be on the invoice, but in addition to what else will it be? And then finally, just to wrap up, these are several of the websites that I do think are interesting for folks. I'm sure the slides will be sent out to you. I lead our government relations, so I feel like I need to give a little likelihood of, are there going to be any changes coming up? So anything is possible in this environment. I personally right now don't feel like there's a huge groundswell in Europe for delay. Some commodities are further along, and some commodities in Europe are frankly pretty close to ready. I will hedge though, and again, go back to anything can happen. This EUDR was in the USTR report on trade barriers. EUDR was listed for the Trump administration. So, you know, what effect that could have, I don't know. But we are acting like as a company that it's going into effect at the end of the year. There's just too much unknown. And again, it's doubtful anything can happen. The EU did publish new FAQs. That link is on here. We're still going through them. And with that, I will happily take any questions. And please let us know how we can help you at Sylvamo. And let me get out of this so Chris can share.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Certainly a lot to think about and consider.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm just going to now follow what Elizabeth said with a little bit more about how we can manage EUDR data in practice in the supply chain. Just a little bit about EDItEUR for those of you who are not familiar with us. Not quite the same scale as Elizabeth, tiny little organization, 2.5 of us here, but we are a global membership, not-for-profit organization, and we manage standards. Most of you will know the standards we manage, Onyx for Books and THEMA. And it's a bit about Onyx for Books that I'm going to talk to you now. Just because jargon, just to remind you, EUDR, European Union Deforestation Regulation is its full name. That's its full title on the screen. Just wanted to point out that it says text with EEA relevance. The really important little clause, when you see that, it applies to the European Economic Area, and importantly, it applies to Northern Ireland as well. Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. So if you trade with the UK, it's important for that market as well. Also, just a quick reminder, there are two types of main EU legislation, directives and regulations. So regulations are legal acts that are part of EU secondary law, which means it's derived from the principles of the treaties, which means it's the same law throughout the member states. They're automatically added to national law. A directive, they're more like guidelines that the EU brings in and says you need to implement these, and each nation state brings those laws in. So important to know that the EUDR is a regulation, so same laws for everybody. So that, as Elizabeth was saying, this was just a quick reminder of what the EUDR is for, to eliminate products in the EU market that might be linked to forest degradation or deforestation. Any product made available on the EU market or exported from the EU market must be 100% deforestation free or be excluded from the EU market. Entered into force June 2023 and becomes rules for medium and large operators the end of this year, 2025. Micro and small enterprises have got a further 6 months delay till the end of June 26. So Onyx and EU directives and regulations, no obligation to use it. There's nothing in any of the EU directives or regulations that say you have to use Onyx, but it is one of the main options for communicating in at least part of the book supply chain. So from publisher onwards, it's not something that printers use much of, or paper manufacturers. Onyx has the advantage of existing, being widely used. It's a widely recognized way of communicating information. It's global as well, so it'll meet the needs of most of your global partners in the supply chain. It's standardized, it's highly structured, so it has all those advantages. Onyx 3.0 and 3.1 are the only versions to fully meet recent legal requirements. Version 2.1, just as a reminder, is now obsolete, is an obsolete standard and does not meet and does not cover all the necessary information. So if you want to meet all the needs, you should be, which most people are now, using one of the Onyx 3 standards. And EDItEUR as an organization, we will carry on adding, as we already have, added any necessary codes or structures to Onyx 3 as we go forward if there are new things that need to be added. And if you have a good comprehensive Onyx 3 message, you're covering most of the information that is needed for EUDR. So the EUDR references the harmonized system codes from the World Customs Organization, so WCO HS commodity codes, and these are used and specifically referenced in Annex 1 of the legislation, and that's really important because it's the products that are covered in those codes that come under EUDR scope. So for our sector, there is it's section 10, chapters 47 and 48, which pulp and paper, which Elizabeth's industry is dealing with, and then chapter 49 covers all printed books. And it's printed books if they are made totally or partially of virgin paper. WCO HS codes are the basis of all the customs codes globally. So the ones that are used in the US, the ones that are used in Canada, but critically, they're also the ones that are used for the EU, both the combined nomenclature and the tariff codes, which are the two systems used for import and export in the EU. Really important. And in your Onyx, at least include the WCO HS code for any product, for any physical product. If that's in your Onyx, people can then calculate for other things. Other metadata in your Onyx, which is really important for EUDR and for other things, describe the physical product in as much detail as possible. So look at list 150 and 175 to describe the format. Not every book that's covered by HS code starting with 49 is made of paper. For example, soft books are made of textile, rag books, or plastics like bath books, obviously out of scope of EUDR. How much recycled paper does a book contain? If it's 100%, then it's out of scope of the EUDR. If it's less than 100%, then any virgin paper is in scope. You can use Onyx code list 79 to state any percentage of recycled paper. Always, always, always include dimensions of the product, especially weight. And please put in metric, so millimeters and grams, as well as US customary units, because it's the metric measurements that are needed for EUDR. Due diligence, Elizabeth mentioned this. Due diligence is really important, both due diligence as a company, you need to understand your supply chain. You need, if you've got partners, Sylvamo, then it's fine that they will do part of the due diligence. You just need to check that they are doing it properly. This is where the risk, where the country is on the risk, minimizes the amount of due diligence you have to do. But basically, you need to understand your supply chain and who is supplying you your product. You will collect information from the paper suppliers and printers, and this is what you need to, as Elizabeth illustrated, you need to pass on down through the supply chain. And that's what we've made sure you can do with Onyx. There's the information that goes in the traces system, and it's created what is called a due diligence statement. We refer to that as the DDS. Operators and traders in the system have different requirements, but you can include all that DDS information in your Onyx 3 file. And it's that DDS reference has to be available to customs authorities before the product is placed on the EU market or exported from the EU. So the traces system links to the EU customs system as well. So it's a way of checking that. So the DDS needs to be available. And that's a screenshot from the training videos of what the EU traces system looks like. So just as a reminder, Graham Bell, who some of you will know, has already done a video presentation about EUDR. There is a recording available, did it for the BISG. We will share that link with you. So watch that, it's about 40 minutes. But just to remind you of some of the things that you can do with Onyx and EUDR. So you can already include the DDS reference number from list 79, but something that wasn't in the video from last time, we've added the verification number. So you can now send the DDS reference number plus the verification number, because at the time of recording the video, we weren't sure if that needed to go in Onyx. You can now add that. It's an 8-digit number. For those of you familiar with Onyx, you need to look at list 79. We have tried to include all the various things that you could need to put into your Onyx record, either the DDSs themselves or cross references to other DDSs further back in the supply chain, as was well illustrated by Elizabeth's diagram. Also, you can put in other information like the fact that the stock was present in the all the stock was present in the EU prior to the date of entry into force, that you've got all the necessary paperwork to know that your supply chain is deforestation free, that you've done the due diligence and the paper you've received is compliant with national law, etc. What we always try and do with all the Onyx codes, for those familiar with the browser, we try and put in notes explaining a bit more about how to use those particular elements. So do have a look at those as well. The one for 50, I believe code 50 has the longest entry, which explains everything. So just to illustrate, this is when you need to include the DDS references from, for example, your printer. If you're creating a new DDS for the book itself, and you're including the DDS references from the printer and the paper manufacturer, you can put those in Onyx as well. This is if you want to put in other information. I've got the information to say that I'm compliant with the national law from where my paper has come from. I have all the necessary deforestation-free attestations. I've done the due diligence. You can also, if you don't yet have the DDS reference, or if you have a downstream partner who needs both the DDS and geolocation data, you can also put all that in. Something that we've added since the video was recorded, you can now put in the Latin name of the species of tree as well. So just in summary, the deadline is nearly here. We can't ignore it. US and Canadian publishers, you need to collect and pass on full data, GPS location, etc., or pass on the DDS references. Onyx allows you to pass on all the data that you have collected and you need. You must do some due diligence on your own supply chains as well. Make sure you know where everything is coming from. Look at any gaps in that due diligence, any places where you may not be sure. Audit your stock. Understand the stock that you're already holding or that you may have sent out. When was it manufactured? When did you receive it into your warehouses? When have you put it on your market? Just be aware of that kind of information in case you need to make some distinctions. Because of the nature, and this is follow up with something Elizabeth said, because of the nature of the EU, because of the multinational nature of the EU and the fact that it's made up of different bodies, EU legislation tends to be long-term. So they tend to make decisions and then things have to go through a whole process. They tend not to change very often. So don't count on things changing very quickly. And also to remember that EU legislation does tend to get copied in other markets as well. So countries that have signed trade agreements with the EU or are candidate countries also tend to copy EU legislation. There you go. That's a quick overview of that. And now both Elizabeth and I are here for questions.
Yeah, thank you. So a number of questions have come in the chat. Starting at the beginning, there was some concerns about wood chips being used in paper manufacture that were sourced from all over the place. Is that still an issue?
Yes, that's what I was referencing in my discussion. Generally for the industry, it's about 40% of the furnish. Every manufacturer is different, but it's not going to be a small amount. So because it's a US supplier, they're not going to go and put they're not going to put the wood chips on the EU market like our EU mills would be doing. So it's a unique to the third country or the US issue. It's something we've raised with the Commission several times because it's, really kind of a waste. I guess wood chips could be used as mulch or could be used in dog beds or whatnot, but if it's really not used in paper manufacturing, it doesn't have a huge market. We've not gotten a clear answer from them on how to handle it. Right now, we're just going to have to treat it like regular wood and get the geolocation from the sawmills that we're taking solid wood and probably over, I forget the word actually, maybe Chris will remember the word that the EU uses in the FAQ, but you're over reporting essentially your data to make sure you're compliant. So yes, it still remains an issue. It's something that the industry's brought up through the Trump administration to bring up to the EU. It's what the Hill has brought up, Capitol Hill has brought up to the EU directly, but we still haven't gotten any clarification from them.
So what are companies doing if the mills aren't going to provide this information? Do they just have to change their paper supplier?
Yeah, I guess. I know there's been a couple of suppliers that have said they're not going to comply. That was late last year. I don't know if that's still the case. I showed you our map for where we have our mills for a reason. We're going to have to comply because we have mills in Europe. So, and we export product from Brazil too. So we are, like I said, working for 2 years on this, on how we're going to comply. And we're getting there. Our fiber suppliers, we've run multiple tests now at this point in the year on the lats, longs, and submitting it into the traces system to get the DDS. So we're well on our way.
And
So,
to supplement what Elizabeth said, and to re-emphasize what Brooke said, we're not lawyers. I'm not giving you any legal advice here. However, there are responsibilities as soon as you become the person that's placing it on the EU market. You have liabilities. If you cannot prove the product is 100% deforestation free, you cannot sell it on the EU market. That's it. So if somebody doesn't supply you that information, do not sell it into the EU at all. Make sure it cannot enter the EU supply chain.
So what about POD? So I know we can do print on demand outside of the EU, then it would be imported as a physical thing. But if it's on demand, like through Amazon or some other supplier, publisher doesn't really know and can't really supply on Onyx what the paper content is, right?
Not in Onyx when it's printed, so when it's printed nearest to customer. But the liability, who is liable, will be a question for lawyers. But somebody still has to create a DDS for that product. But no, in Onyx doesn't allow you to put in that information for when you're PODing in different places.
So essentially, that's like an open question that a publisher would need to get an answer to before they would want to place something available for POD through Amazon or what have you.
That for a publisher, that should come under their due diligence, small lowercase due diligence, as in, right, I have verified this supplier has done all the necessary due diligence on their side. They're complying with EUDR, so I am comfortable using them as my POD supplier on the European market.
Yeah, but that's like make to stock. If it's make to order, then we just need to say, no, if you can't do this, then you can't have this file, right? Something like that.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Again, talk to, because this is about liabilities, who is liable. And so I emphasize, talk to your counsel just to see who's liable in those cases.
Great advice. We had another question about somebody hearing that this really only applied from wood that was harvested after December 13th, 2025. But I think I saw something different in the presentation.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, so it's when the product is placed on the market. So we are kind of backing in that we're going to need to have our wood coordinates known several months before that because it's going to go downstream to other customers. There is another regulation called EUDR. the EUs that I need to look at again about if the wood is compliant under, no, is my internet messing up? Hopefully it's okay. I just got a note that popped up. It's frustrating when you're at the office and your internet is worse than when you're at home. But under EUDR, there's a chart in the FAQs on the timing that I would need to refresh my memory on, that if you're compliant under EUDR, then you should be able to place your product on the market. But I'm gonna need to look that up before I go further to make sure. I don't know, Chris, if you're familiar with the chart I'm thinking about in the new FAQs and how the EUDR works with the EUDR.
The EUDR, EU timber regulations, is what preceded EUDR. So EUDR sets a date of 2020, I think 31st of December 2020 for, so that's when they're measuring deforestation from that date. So anything harvest. Then there's the 2023 date. So that's when it came into rule. So it's stock placed on the market after that date. And therefore you get that interim period when it's coming in, when you should be aware of the stock went onto the market in 23. And with there is a chart on the ETR where so there is timber. Yeah, I did read that whole thing as well, but now it's gone.
Yeah, I know. We'll have to get back to you on that point of the interplay between EUTR and EUDR.
Because this is Graham. I think it's fairly clear that the 13th of December 2025 is not the last date on which you can chop down a tree and not cause deforestation. All the benchmark dates for this are in either 2023 or in 2020, but we're not sure which at this point.
Yeah.
And if a title were already in distribution in the EU, this is more like a printing issue, as in the per printing, as opposed to like when it's available in past printings.
It's your inventory is what I'm hearing the question is if you are putting it on the EU market after December 31st of 2025, then you're going to have the reference number or the due diligence statement on that product. So we as a manufacturer are going to need to know those coordinates, because at our facilities right now, there's wood piles and chip harvests that'll be there for 60 days. So we're going to need to know back in November where that wood was harvested, so we can then supply a DDS statement to the customer, to the book manufacturer that's placing it January 2nd of 2026.
Okay.
Is that the question?
Anybody can come off of mute and evaluate it. So,
yeah. And Onyx allows you to send a confirmation that your product was manufactured and put on the EU market prior to the 2023 date.
Okay.
Yes, and you can also attest to the fact that stock was physically present within the EU by the end of December this year.
All right. So another question here. This publisher is asking, they don't know whether or not a particular book will be sold into the EU, like through distributors or however. I'm guessing that doesn't matter. If it's likely to go into the EU, if it's likely to go into the EU, you're going to have to do it.
Theoretically, yes. You'd have to take all measures necessary to exclude it from Europe. Let's say Europe as a whole, to make sure it doesn't. So you'd have to be, in your Onyx, be very clear in your sales rights where you can and can't, where that book can and cannot be sold.
Very good.
You could contract with somebody inside the Europe and say, look, can you print these ones for me in Europe on maybe on a POD basis? Again, that's not legal advice.
Yeah, the key to it is placing it on the market, not actually selling it, but making it available for sale. And if you place it on the market in the EU, then it's subject to EUDR requirements.
So
even if it's fulfilled from outside.
Okay. There was another comment about at PCPA, someone heard that if a roll or some quantity of paper can consist of mixed pulp from multiple locations, that needs the reference number, right?
Yeah, if it's different companies, yeah. Yeah.
And it would be pretty common for a roll of paper to be made of, even coming from a single company, it would be made of pulp that has been sourced in various different places.
That's right. So it seems like the tracking, it really needs to be traceability all the way back to the roll. And then the paper company can identify like where the source is. The printer says what roll it was made with, and it's just more an attribute that needs to go along with the printing. So that's interesting. So that would mean that publishers would need lot control mostly to manage this.
That's a very interesting question. Yes, lot control would be useful, but we don't have lot control usually in our industry. We yes, in warehouse management. But what do you do about returns and stock that comes back in that you resell and things like that? So that's a very interesting question for the supply chain.
So Ken, as you remember in the last presentation last September, I think it was, this was one of the questions that came up. And given that we don't have lot control in our industry, given that we use returns to fulfill new orders, and given that you can't order a copy from a specific impression, the thing that EDItEUR recommends, or the approach that EDItEUR recommends, is that you take a cumulative approach. So if you've currently just started fulfilling the third edition, the DDS, sorry, the third impression, the third reprint, the DDS should reference all the papers that have been used for the first impression, the second and the third impression, because you can't guarantee which that a copy will come from a particular impression when it gets to retail.
Yeah, so
cumulative approach.
Is it exactly? So is it possible to accumulate the reference numbers, or do you have to have a DDS for every potential combination along the way?
You can accumulate. You mean, can you send multiple DDSs or have a? You can send multiple DDSs, yes.
Okay, so that might be the way to accumulate it versus
it could be. The other possibility is that when you do a new impression, you clone the old DDS, which creates a new one with a new DDS number, and then you add any new papers that you've used for that new impression.
All right. That's good. Are the certification systems like FSC and PEFC evolving to adapt or align with the EUDR requirements?
I think FSC is working on something to try to help certification, but the regulation itself says that those will not be enough and that you need to comply with EUDR.
Okay. So essentially, if the first 5 printings were pre-EUDR and you're mixing stock, sorry, I'm jumping back to the other question because another question came in. So if you've had, multiple impressions pre-EUDR, now you're doing the next one, because you don't know where all that came from, you need to somehow accumulate what the sources might have been for that previous stock. Was that clear?
I think the question is clear.
Okay.
The answer may not be.
Right.
But broadly, yes, you do need to be sure about the previous impressions as well. But you don't need to go back to 1973. You only need to go back to what's effectively the inception date. It will either be 2023 or 2020, as we mentioned earlier.
Okay, that's good. Let me actually open, I didn't ask all of the questions showing up in the chat because they were like ripping by so fast. If anyone wants to come off of mute and ask their question, or Brian, if you spotted, or Brooke, if you spotted anything in there, please help me out here. Marielle?
I'm saying man, we want the papers. Some of our colleagues seem to want.
Ah.
So there are a few questions we can go back to. I wanted to apologize to Chris. I muted him briefly because Graham and Chris are sitting in the same space, so there was a little bit of an echo when Graham was giving his earlier remarks.
Did you have
another, Brian?
You spotted another question, Brian?
There's one. Davita's asking, what about publishers who use KEP in Europe? Davita, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
I mean, we use LSI, we use Amazon's KEP for their old Create Space program, and we're not going to know where our POD vendors are printing, especially, I just can't imagine Amazon's going to make this easy.
This is the due diligence in your supply chain again. So this is about conversations with them to make sure that they are doing the necessary due diligence if they are printing copies of your book. They are a big company, LSI and Kindle KEP, both very large companies, both companies that are well aware of regulations and are likely to be doing everything necessary to comply with that. So the onus is if anything ever came back to you as a publisher is to say, look, here's a paper trail or an email trail. We asked the conversation, we had the conversation, we checked with them, they've guaranteed that they have done all the necessary due diligence, etc. So again, it's about covering yourself in the event of liability with the.
I also think that,
again, can I emphasize non-legal?
Right. And I would say that Amazon, the print on demand portion of Amazon was one of the first to approach BISG and ask questions about the implications of EUDR. So it may be, although Amazon's a large company, I think they have been paying attention to this and may have solutions. So reaching out is a good idea.
We talked to Amazon about 1.5 years or 2 years ago on it, so I know that they are certainly tracking it. Just just on this risk mitigation, again, not a lawyer, but our general plans on risk mitigation and risk assessment is we'll have something on our website that provides, I don't want to say generally because it won't be general. It'll go into specifics about the risk that we've done on our risk mitigation we've done on our supply chain. And then if customers want more, different regions, Brazil has a lot of local laws that you've got to comply with. So there may be customers like in Brazil that we might need to go a little bit further into how we're complying with local laws and whatnot. So a lot of that will be outward facing on our website. And then we'll work with customers if there's further risk mitigation that they want to do. I mean, for larger customers, sometimes we do tours and whatnot of the supply chain. And so we can answer questions along those lines too. But I thought I'd give a quick little how we intend to right now adhere to some of the risk mitigation practices.
Jennifer Eckenrode had a really good question about a checklist that a publisher might be able to use to manage their EUDR compliance. I don't know if such a thing exists, but EDItEUR or BISG could probably be a good home for something like that.
Agreed. I think that what we're thinking about is emulating something that BIC in the UK has already done. They put together a group 2 weeks ago. It met for the first time of supply chain representatives. They had about 30 folks in a room for a day. Graham, I think you were able to be part of that, and probably some other folks on the call were as well. We've been holding off a bit to try and see what the mid-year updates look like. The UK needs to move a little bit earlier because their exposure for exports into Europe are larger than ours, at least on a share scale. So we anticipate doing something like that to create kind of a checklist that would cut across the supply chain. Elizabeth has given us some really good guidance, both in a supply chain meeting earlier this year and today. So we can kind of build on that.
We're kind of drawing near the witching hour here. Any last questions that anybody would like to ask?
I wanted to, well, Graham has agreed to stick around when Elizabeth and Chris have to drop. But so if there are more questions, but I wanted to kind of give you a sweet spot question, Elizabeth, for what happens when you have an inventory of pulp that comes from a lot of different places. You gave a really good answer in the supply chain conversation we had a few months ago about how Sylvamo thinks about this. Essentially that if you were trying to pick a day, it's really hard. But if you look over a month or a 2-month period, you have greater certainty. So.
Yeah, so we right now intend to do a monthly, so a monthly DDS. So we are going to look at, let's say, November's wood that came into the gate, and that wood is then going to be December's paper made, if that makes sense. So in Brazil, we might speed that up because we control the land better. So it might be a little shorter than a month, but and I think in Europe, we're going to do a month too. So again, it would be November's wood harvest coming in. We'll get all those lat and longs from the wood harvest of where those polygons were in the forest. Same for chips. And then we will make that into December's production.
Right. So I mean, it sounds simple at the outset. I'm sure there's a lot of moving parts within that, but effectively you're trying to use a broader window so that you can make sure that you're declaring exactly what was consumed.
Yeah, it goes to that over reporting piece. In fact, the last FAQs talked about an annual report. We're looking at that. Some concerns could be on an annual report. Yes, you're over reporting, but if for some reason that landowner decided to turn that wood harvest into a corn crop the next year, that would be deforestation. And so that whole year's worth of geolocations could all be at risk if you do it annually. So these are some of the thought processes that not just the paper industry, but cocoa and soy are all having conversations about. But the FAQs did allow for a year, which was interesting because when we were over in Europe talking to the commission about this, they said, "Oh, we won't do a year." But then it was in the new FAQs. So for us, we're looking at a month time frame for the wood coming into the mill. And we get 12, 13, 14 truckloads a day, sometimes more.
Well, as you have to log off, thank you very much for participating and answering the questions. Christopher, great. Elizabeth, really great having you. Thank you again for showing up here.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
I see a note, the FAQ document. In my slides, there was a link for the FAQ and the guidance, the new updated guidance documents.
Yep. And just to confirm, recording of this session and the slides will be distributed after the fact. So you'll have all of those resources in your inbox.
Great. Thank you all. Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So Graham, I did see another question come in here about ARCs and samples.
Yes, and actually it was half answered in the chat. Somebody also asked where the FAQs came from. The EU has published a series of FAQ documents I think we're up to about version 5 now, maybe version 4. At each stage, those FAQs have got more detailed. One of them talks about samples, but says that they need to be kind of used up or destroyed. And that's not really relevant to our sort of use case. The thing with the FAQs is the EU produces these FAQ documents, and they are really intended not just for the book industry, but for all other timber industries, for the beef industry, for the cocoa and coffee industry, and so on. The FAQs are very broad, so they're not always that helpful. I would take the view, and remember, I'm not a lawyer either, but I would take the view that things like advanced reading copies, things like samples would be equally subject to the EUDR rules, simply because they are part of putting that product on the market. You may be creating some ARCs a little bit earlier, but the sensible thing to do would be to create them from paper that is compliant. The reason for that is that if an ARC is imported into the EU, it is not destroyed in the process of somebody reading it. It's available for other people as well. And so I'd be quite maybe conservative. I'd be quite risk averse for things like samples and ARCs.
What of an argument for digital galleys?
It is indeed a very good argument for that.
Graham, I don't know if this question falls into your sweet spot, but does Onyx support a declaration that you've used only recycled fibers and therefore are exempt from EUDR requirements? You may be muted.
You're absolutely right.
Thanks.
You can indeed within Onyx state that your paper is entirely 100% recycled.
Okay.
Now, just bear in mind with that applies not only to the book block, but also to the covers and any jacket as well.
Right. Yeah. So components have to be spelled out. And were you going to ask something?
No, I was going to point out the same thing, that it's not just the book block. Yeah. There was a question, as a print buyer, will I be able to tell what papers are compliant when specifying papers? My guess is that you have to specify that they are compliant, and that the printer then needs to make sure that they are.
Yeah, I would think that if the publisher is not responsible for buying the paper, then they would have to contractually oblige anybody who is supplying paper to ensure that paper is compliant. Yes.
Yeah.
And that is one of the, I was just going to add that that's one of the things that we're trying to think through with that supply chain conversation that we anticipate mid-year, is working out what kind of scenarios and how they could be, we need to support and how they could be best supported.
And that's ultimately part of the due diligence that everybody in the supply chain has a duty to carry out.
All right, we're kind of slowing down here. Anything further?
I have a question. For small and micro publishers, is there, where we have a little bit more time, is there any way that we need to communicate that in our data, that product is coming from a small publisher?
In the Onyx, no. There's no field in Onyx that says I'm a micro trader, because ultimately these micro and small organizations are going to be dealing with large organizations. So I think it's kind of something of a misrepresentation that tiny companies will have extra 6 months. They will need to deal with large companies, and those large companies are still required to get the data. It would only be the case that you've got the full extra 6 months if everybody in the supply chain was a micro company. So we don't have that in Onyx. We could add it if we find it's required, but the requirements for small and micro are both very precise and also very small, and not a whole lot of organizations will fall into those categories. And where they do, they will probably have to supply the data anyway, because the large companies in their supply chain will require it by the end of this year.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, no more questions?
I have a question.
Oh, hey, Danielle.
Hello, Kim. I had a question I had written down, book team project. Maybe they can help with due diligence. Maybe they can help with due diligence. Last time that they narrowed down a short list of deforestation and forest degradation data providers. I'm just wondering if anyone's heard anything about how close they've gotten to finding a solution, and if that would be helpful to public.
Currently, I'm not familiar, but Graham, you were going to say something.
I was going to say I'm not really familiar with that, but it is important to understand that the criterion that the EU will use is based on a thing called the observatory, which, as I understand it, is essentially a series of satellite photographs that were taken in 2020, and it will be that is the deciding factor about whether or not deforestation has taken place.
I think like there was one company called Saddle, oh, how do I say this? Satelligence? Satellite-based monitoring solutions specializing in near real-time detection and analysis of deforestation, forest degradation, and sustainability metrics.
Yes, I mean, it was interesting in the last session we had on this topic back in September last year. One of the questions was, how is this going to be enforced? Because I think the person who asked that question, and I hope you're here today as well, actually, whoever that was, the person who asked that question at that point, at least, imagined people going around and checking on the trees. But this will be done, from space. The forests are relatively straightforward to monitor from space. You can tell whether there are trees there. You can tell that the trees have been chopped down. You can, of course, tell also that the trees have been replanted. And so a set of satellite photographs covering the forests of the world is the way it will be done. The EU will be looking at its own observatory. There will, without doubt, be third-party data available, possibly from the company that you mentioned, Danielle.
Quickly, hi, this is Jane Searle from Norton. I'm just wondering if the questions from the chat that were not addressed, will they be followed up on in the chat after this meeting?
The ones that weren't addressed were because I didn't see them in the flood. If you've got one, ask it though.
Well, I've got a few, but we're at time here. I don't want to keep people on. If folks are willing to follow up, which would you rather?
Ask your question now.
Okay. Question one was about the infamous traces system. A few questions. Who exactly is allowed or required to use it? Is there extant documentation in it that's required to be completed that will satisfy our industry, or does new documentation still need to be created? If the latter, what is the timeline on that?
So Traces is available now. It's reasonably well documented. There is online training available, but currently it is only accessible to organisations who have an EU-based EURI number. That's an economic actor number. It is an open question whether Traces will be opened up to organisations that are non-EU organisations. My betting is it will, but that's only my personal feeling. If it's not, then every North American publisher, and indeed every publisher in the UK, would have to get some third party to create the DDSs for products that those organisations will export to the EU. But my guess is that it will be opened up to non-EU parties so that those organisations can create DDSs prior to them exporting a product to the EU. So answer your question, right now it's EU only. My personal expectation is it will be opened up to non-EU organisations.
Okay, next quick question. Do you know what risk level Canada is?
The risk levels for countries haven't been announced yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought someone said the US had been deemed low risk.
What Elizabeth said was that she'd read a report from Bloomberg that the US was going to be nominated as a low risk country.
Gotcha.
But we're not actually expecting the full official list until the summer this year. And it's also worth bearing in mind that those risk levels will fluctuate over time. 5 years from now, the high risk countries are not going to be the same list of countries as they will be this July.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming up, Jane. Okay, now we are definitely at the end. Graham, thank you for hanging out and answering the further questions. Really great session. A lot of great participation. Still a huge number of participants, even here at the end. So thank you again.
My pleasure, and I hope it was useful.
Yes, thank you very much. And one last reminder to everyone, the recording will be distributed to everybody that registered using that registration email. We'll also have slides from our presenters, Chris and Elizabeth, and I'll drop in the link to that prior EUDR recording that EDItEUR worked on with us with collaboration with BookNet Canada. So those resources come into your inbox soon.
Can you give me a